Now a discussion about the influence of common people in the American Revolution. This event's about an hour and a half.
Education, and on behalf of our Dean, Jerry Murphy, I'm very happy to welcome you here tonight. I'd also welcome you to pick up a flyer of the upcoming events that we have here. We will be finishing our forum season here on May 15th, but next week we have Jean Traunstein, who is speaking about her new book, Shakespeare Behind Bars, and showing excerpts, film excerpts from her prison students' performance of Merchant of Venice. And on Thursday of that week, we have Robert Torres, a gay Puerto Rican educator who was the narrator and subject of a really amazing film called New Yorican Dream. And we will be showing that movie and discussing the film with Robert Torres afterwards. And on May 7th, Mary Mazzio, Carol Gilligan, and Mary Jo Kane, who's the University of Minnesota's director of the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sports, will be here to show and talk about the Title IX film called A Hero for Daisy, which is about the tenacious 1976 Yale women's rowing team. And Franz de Waal, a primatologist from Emory University, will be here to talk about The Ape and the Sushi Master. That has to be an all-time great title, on May 9th. And we end our forum season with Ray Kurzweil, the inventor extraordinaire and techie guy, and author of The Age of the Spiritual Machine, who's going to be in conversation with Howard Gardner, the multiple intelligences guru, and the two of them will be speaking about intelligence, computer, and human. So we would welcome you to any or all of those, and but of course for tonight we're here to listen to and experience, and for those of you who know Howard, you know the informed word is experience, both Howard Zinn and Ray Raphael. It's actually quite wonderful to have them here this week. Both Howard and Ray are known for their social consciousness and their social activism, relic terms often associated with the 60s and the 70s. But this week, Harvard Yard has been the site of an extraordinary burst of social activism as Harvard students have taken over Memorial Hall to protest the failure of the university to pay some of its employees a living wage. I hope you'll indulge me as I quote from an open letter to the community from over a dozen housemasters as it appeared in the Crimson yesterday. We, as housemasters, recognize that the issue of a living wage affects the quality of our community life in the Harvard houses. In the houses, the living wage issue has a human face. The Living Wage Campaign invites us to ask if we are doing as much as we can to ensure that the workers in our communities are receiving adequate compensation for their work and their contributions to our daily lives. We appreciate the care and diligence of our students in bringing this issue of wages to the attention of the entire Harvard community in their work and written reports over the past 2 years. We have deep respect for their commitment to social and economic justice, and we support them in their commitments. And it has really been quite extraordinary to see how the Harvard community has really rallied solidly behind this issue. We could never, in our wildest dreams, have contrived such a meaningful welcome for Howard and Ray. Two men committed to writing and teaching about history from the point of view of those who are often most neglected and ignored. Howard and Ray exercise what they call a bottom-up approach to examining new and critical perspectives on the American past. And in doing so, they've created histories which resonate with all of us. Their histories tell stories. And through engaging us in the struggles of ordinary people, they give us connection, understanding, and insight to times and events which previously seemed lifeless and irrelevant. People of all colors from every class and economic level walk through their books, and in doing so, help us to understand not the extraordinary, but the ordinary events which cumulatively make up the fabric of this country. Howard Zinn is the series editor and inspiration for the New Press's People's History. He is a professor emeritus at Boston University, despite John Silber's best wishes, and author of A People's History of the United States, the award-winning Declarations of Independence, Failure to Quit, as well as a recent memoir entitled, and another excellent title, You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. He is also the author of the play Marx in Soho. Ray Raphael grew up in New York City, received his BA from Reed College and his MA from Berkeley. He then left academia to work in the peace and civil rights movements of the 60s before becoming part of the Back to the Land movement of the 70s, moving to the backwoods of Northern California, removed from electricity, telephone, and pavement. While living there, he taught in a one-room public high school teaching history, math, English, forestry, and physical education. He's a prolific writer. His works include An Everyday History of Somewhere, The Teacher's Voice, The Men from the Boys, Rites of Passage in Male America, and now A People's History of the American Revolution. Tonight we'll begin with Howard Zinn, then move to Ray Raphael, and we will finally give you all a chance to ask your own questions. So thank you for coming. Howard?
All right. Thank you, Dottie Engler, for organizing this. I think you organized this. You're the one who always calls me. So, very happy to be here with Ray Raphael. We actually, we've done a couple of things before. We just did something in New York, and we were together in California. It's becoming a thing. And I'm very glad Dottie has started off talking about what's going on here, the students sitting in for a living wage, because you're right, if we're writing a history of Harvard University, we might leave them out, unless we were doing a people's history of Harvard University. And if we're doing a people's history of Harvard University, then we would have them. And then we'd have the anti-war protesters of the 60s. And then we'd have the members of the John Reed Club. We'd have all the people who were turned over to the FBI by Harvard University. Now, maybe I'm exaggerating, but well, there's some connection between Harvard University and the establishment. Isn't there? I think so. No? But no, of course not. But I suppose I contrast this, the sit-in, as a people's history, and I contrast that with the other Harvard, and the other Harvard is epitomized for me by walking into Widener Library. And unless they have now removed it, but I doubt it. But then when you go up the stairs of Widener Library, you see this tribute to a soldier. And tribute to a soldier is good, except that there's a slogan that accompanies this tribute to a soldier. And there are different ways you can pay tribute to a soldier. And there's a way you pay tribute to a soldier which is unsettling. And this tribute at Harvard, it says, happy is he who with one embrace clasps death and victory. Am I right? Do you remember that? Yeah. I didn't like that, you say. And every time I went into Widener, that I was reminded of that. So anyway, it's good. These people who are sitting in are reminding us of the invisible people. And that's the idea of a people's history. That's what Ray is doing in his People's History of the American Revolution. I'm not the co-author of that book. So, right? Some people think, because my name appears, I have to make sure, even though I want to be the co-author of every good book, but I'm not the co-author of that book. But the New Press, which is doing this series, said to me, will you be general editor of the series of People's History series? And I thought, I don't want to be general editor of anything. And then they, because I think of general editors being one of these academic entrepreneurs, No. But then they sent me Ray's book, and I read it, and I thought, wow, I've read a fair amount on the American Revolution. This is the best single book on the American Revolution that I've read. So happy to do this. So, yes, there's a connection between the history of invisible people in the past and the story of invisible people in the present. There's the connection between, the invisible people of the American Revolution and its time and the invisible people in our time. And it seems to me you can go from one to the other. That is, by looking at the present and being conscious of the people we don't notice in the present, you can then be induced to look into the past and say, hey, what are the counterparts of these people I know about today, the cleaning people and the immigrants and the hard-working people who are overlooked? What is their counterpart in the past? And that leads you to a people's history of the past. That leads you to look for different things in the past than the kind of things you get in traditional textbooks. Or you can go the other way. You can go into history and read a book like Ray's, or read other books that will tell you about Native Americans and women and black people and working people and African Americans, and then ask yourself, what is their counterpart today? But in either way, a connection is made between the past and the present. And it's important to know that, because there's no point going into the past if you're never going to come out of it. And there's no point going to the past unless you're going to make a connection between what you learn about the past and what you see, in the present. I must tell you, let's see, how I came to, this sounds very dramatic, how I came to my present point of wisdom. I must tell you how I came to think of, doing people's history. I was in the South. I was living in the South. I was teaching at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, in Black Women's College. Became involved in the movement, and then became involved with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Began moving around the South, becoming a kind of writer participant in the movement. Went to Albany, Georgia, and Selma, Alabama, and wherever SNCC was doing things, wherever the movement was engaged, and going into towns in Mississippi and Jackson and Greenwood and Greenville and Hattiesburg and so on. And it occurred to me, the things I was seeing, I know were not being recorded anywhere. They're not becoming part of anyone's history. Oh, sure, I was reading in the papers about what the heads of the NAACP were saying and what the latest legal struggles were, on the level of courts and, and what possible legislation there might be in Congress and what the president might be saying. But the things that I was seeing on the ground level were not becoming part of history. And so I wrote a letter to Columbia University, my alma mater. Well, I don't have a maternal or paternal relationship, but, it's, let's put it this way. I went to Columbia University, and that's where I got my doctorate. That's where I did my graduate work. And I knew they had an oral history project, which was new at that time. Now oral history is known. That time, oral history was new. There was no Studs Terkel around then. Well, he was around, but he wasn't doing those things. And oral history project. And I had, in fact, done some work in the Columbia University Oral History Project. And I knew what the Oral History Project consisted of. It consisted of somebody interviewing ex-secretaries of state, ex-generals, ex-admirals, ex-almost everybody who was important in the higher echelons of government and industry, and, trying to catch them before they died. And that's the trick of oral history. You follow the health reports, and you interview people who are about to go, and you get them at the right moment. Because I knew that's what the Oral History Project consisted of. And so I wrote to Columbia University, I wrote to the Oral History Project, and I said, hey, well, I didn't start off that way, because you don't write that way to Columbia University. But I said, there's terrific oral history to be done down here. I mean, come down, send somebody down here with tape recorders. Tape the people in Albany, Georgia, who's been demonstrating. I mean, who knows what's happening in Albany, Georgia Tape these people who've just come out of jail in Albany, Georgia. Well, a good part of the black population in Albany, Georgia has been in jail. Talk to them. Go to Selma, Alabama. Tape the Selma Freedom Chorus and a church rally that takes place before people are going out to try to register to vote in Selma. You know, go to Greenwood, Mississippi. Talk to Mrs. Ruby Pilcher, who lives next door to the Freedom House set up by the SNCC workers and who brings them food and takes care of them, and talk to her about her life. And you know, that's oral history. I got this letter back from Columbia University. That's a wonderful idea. When somebody starts off that way, you get very suspicious. A wonderful idea, you know, it's like Gandhi said about Western civilization, a great idea. You know, yeah. But we don't have the resources. We don't have the resources. Columbia University doesn't have the resources to do that. It's like Harvard University doesn't have the resources to pay a living wage to its workers, right? None of these people, you know, it's like, you know, really, it's like it's always that way. I mean, the people with the most resources don't have the resources. You know, the richest country in the world doesn't have the resources to take care of the health needs of 40 million people. You know, that's the story on every possible level. They don't have the resources. But what it really means is they don't have the interest. It means they don't care. That's what it really means. It means that they don't need these people. They don't need to represent these invisible people because we're represented. We're represented by the Secretary of State. You know, we're represented by the people up on high. They're the ones who take care of things. And so, you know, we don't need these voices. That's the idea. And the premise of this is that this is one big family, this country. And we all have a common interest. So that, therefore, the people who are on top, they can represent everybody. We aren't divided by class and race and sex and this and that. No, it's as the Constitution begins, the preamble of the Constitution begins, we the people of the United States, right? It's all of us got together in Philadelphia. Those 55 rich white men who got together in Philadelphia, this wonderful multicultural group got together in Philadelphia, and we the people of the United States, you know. No, so they think, yeah, we're all one, and therefore we can be represented by the people with money and power. And so, in fact, we have the language to exemplify that. We have, you know, the national interest. Shall we do this? Shall we go here? Shall we send troops there? Shall we bomb here? Well, if it's in the national interest. In whose interest? There is no national, there's no single entity. There's no, what Kurt Vonnegut spoke, a grand falloon, some of you may remember. A grand falloon is this sort of something which is sort of encompasses everything, pretends to encompass everything, you see, but it can't, you know. It's a great big bubble, you see, and which is artificial, which needs to be punctured by the truth in order to reveal the complexities inside, in order to reveal the different interests that are inside this bubble. And there are different interests in America. And so there's no such thing as the national interest, national defense, national security. Or is it somebody's securities? That's, you know, closer to it. But that's the pretense, you know, that we have all this common interest. And no recognition of the fact that we are a class society, have always been. And well, you'll read about the revolutionary period, and I mean, that's one of the things that Ray brings out in his book. But I mean, this is true all through American history. You could write a history of the United States, an overview history of the United States, and start off with a sentence: the history of the United States is a history of class struggle. Well, that would be a dangerous way to start off. It would be hard to get a publisher mainstream, certainly a mainstream publisher to do a history night. But the truth is that, yes, we were a society riven by class right from the very beginning, riven by race, right from the beginning. It's not that, we were all pilgrims, coming here dressed in those funny costumes, sharing everything, writing the Mayflower Conflict. I remember all that stuff given. No. There was us, and there were the Native Americans. There were the blacks and slaves, and there were the slaveholders. There were the servants. There were the masters. There were the people given huge grants of land, huge grants of land. Other people, no land at all, propertyless people from the beginning and up all through American history. James Madison recognized this when he was writing in the Federalist Papers and he was trying to persuade people to ratify the Constitution. He said, well, we need a government. We need a strong government. Why do we need a strong government? Because, well, there's conflict. Society is divided into factions. Federalist number 10, right? Society is divided into factions. Based on what? Some people have property, some people don't have property. Now, there's going to be conflict. We've got to do something about controlling this conflict. We have this nice, new, strong government. It will help to control this conflict. He was very aware, as were all the founding fathers, as were all those people who gathered together in Philadelphia, very conscious of the rebellions that had just taken place after the Revolution. Just Shays' Rebellion being the most recent one, just before. There's an important conjunction between the Shays' Rebellion of 1786 and the framing of the Constitution in 1787, because the framers of the Constitution were very conscious of the fact that out in western Massachusetts, thousands of farmers had gathered and rebelled against the elite of Boston, against the high taxes that they had to pay, and they had surrounded courthouses, and they had prevented the court proceedings from going on. This was a real rebellion. And there were similar rebellions in other parts of the country, in Virginia, in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, similar rebellion. And the founding fathers were conscious of this. And one of the Washington's generals, General Knox, wrote to him after Shays' Rebellion, said, hey, I always think these guys start off that way, but they're very elegant writers, those. But in effect, he said, these people in Shays' Rebellion, many of them veterans, veterans of the Revolutionary War. Captain Daniel Shays himself a veteran. Many of these people, veterans of the Revolutionary War, they come back and they find that all those promises, oh, how universal a story this is, of veterans being given promises that if they fight and sacrifice, that they will come back and there'll be a new world and so on. And Knox writes to Washington, says, these people fought in the they think because they fought in the Revolution that now the fruits, the wealth of this country belongs equally to them. Well, this is dangerous. And so a government is set up which is going to try to control rebellion. I mean, that was the idea of the Constitution. The idea of the Constitution was not, as even some very prominent historians said, oh, they wanted to, these are very wise. They were smart men, eloquent men, and so on. But the myth is that their idea was to set up a democratic society and liberty and justice. And no, that was not. The intent was to set up a government that would be able to control things, be able to deal with Indians as the settlers moved out west, be able to deal with the slave rebellions, to be able to deal with working people who rebelled. That was the idea of it. So, well, so in fact, a government was set up that was able to deal with that, and has been able to deal with that ever since. Because ever since then, we've had government and legislation that was represented a particular class of Americans. It didn't represent the poor, and didn't represent the black, and didn't represent the immigrants, and didn't represent the Native Americans. The history of legislation in this country from that point to this point has been a history of legislation to benefit a very small group of people. There have been a few departures from that at a time when there were great social movements that forced, you might say, pressured for departures from that, in the 1930s and the New Deal in the 1960s with those movements and so on. But by and large, that has been the story, and a history, a society divided by class and race and so on. And so it, I'm looking at the clock because, you know, we have a deal. I'm a very disciplined person. Listen to orders. And the people who run these things are very tough. Don't be deceived by their appearance, you know. And so the history, when you have a society divided this way, history is going to reflect those conflicts and those divisions. It can't be a neutral history, a history of which, oh, the history represents everybody. History is going to be written from a point of view. And some people are going to be left out, and some people are going to be given prominent attention. And so when you think about doing history or writing, presenting history, it's inevitable, right? That you have an enormous mass of data. And inevitably, you must choose from that enormous mass of data what you are going to present when you write history, or when you teach history. And you choose according to what you think is important. That is, you choose according to your point of view. And depending on where you are and where you sit and who you're trying to please, you will have a different notion, of what, is important. But if you look at it from the point of view of people who have been generally left out of the dominant landscape of American history, things look different. The American Revolution looks different from the point of view of Indians. The Jacksonian period, I remember, was taught to us as Jacksonian democracy. Those words always went together. Jacksonian democracy. Jackson was a slaveholder. Jackson was a racist. Jackson was an Indian killer. And in the period of Jacksonian democracy, the industries were beginning in New England, and girls were going to work at the age of 12 and dying at the age of 25. And in this period of Jacksonian democracy, and also this was a period in which the Army of the United States, with Jackson's orders, was driving the Indians of the Southeast out of their homes across the Mississippi, the Trail of Tears. 4,000 out of 16,000 die in the Trail of Tears. This was Jacksonian democracy. So looking at Jacksonian democracy from different points of view, you have to separate those two words. You look at the Civil War from the standpoint of Indians. The Civil War is a war for the liberation of slaves. Yes, and in fact, there's a kind of emancipation that takes place as a result of the Civil War. And yet, during the Civil War, while armies were fighting the Confederates in various parts of the country, other parts of the army were out west annihilating Indian tribes. More land was taken away from Indians during the years of the Civil War than in any comparable period in American history. So yes, if you look at the Civil War from a different point of view, it becomes something else. The Industrial Revolution, the great economic miracle of the United States. And I remember sitting there in class and marveling at, wow, that's when we became a great economic power. And we're taught to take pride in, the wealth of Carnegie, or the achievements of the great, and in how many steel ingots were produced, and how many miles of railroad track were laid, and it's all us. It's all us. Our interests are the same, you see. And but from the point of view of the people who worked in Rockefeller's oil refineries, the people who worked the Chinese and Irish immigrants who worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, from a standpoint of the people who worked in Carnegie steel mills, it wasn't simply the great economic miracle, and there was a human cost to economic progress, which is not much dealt with in the traditional histories of, that great period of industrial expansion between the Civil War and World War I. So, yes, different points of view depending on, well, take the so-called progressive era in American history. I say so-called. It wasn't so-called. Okay. Progressive era. Why? Some reforms were passed. Roosevelt was president. Progressive era is exactly that period in which more black people were lynched in this country than any other period. You know, Roosevelt, the great progressive. Roosevelt, you know, there he is on Mount Rushmore. A warmonger, a militarist, a lover of war, a man who observes a massacre taking place in the Philippines while he's president and congratulates the general who orders the massacre of 600 Philippine men, women, and children. But you know, our heroes, when you look at it, depending on your point of view, the heroes are different. You know, it's no longer Theodore Roosevelt. It's Emma Goldman and Mother Jones, you know, and Helen Keller and Eugene Debs, you know, and Frederick Douglass and W.B. Du Bois. You know, you just get different heroes depending on your point of view. And I have a few more minutes. I just want to assure the people who are threatening me that I have a few more minutes, you see. And, but I guess the one thing I want to say, ignore all the other things I was saying. I'll preface this all. The one thing I want to say is that this approach to history, this presenting of history from a standpoint of what do our leaders do, you know, what is Congress, you know, telling the story of America from the standpoint of what are the statutes passed by Congress and what are decisions made by the Supreme Court and what are the edicts, you know, by the presidents and so on, and who are the military heroes that we should erect statues to. This approach is a profoundly undemocratic one. And we're presumably a democratic country, but that's a profoundly undemocratic approach to history, the leaving out of the point of view of people who are, yes, invisible, who don't have power, and what it does, that kind of history, it creates a passive citizenry. It creates a citizenry that believes that the important things that are done by important people, and that all that is left for us to do, all that's left for citizens to do, is to engage in the most puny act of citizenship, and that is to vote. Really, because all we have to do is vote for these, you know, we have a choice. What a choice we always have. But to vote, that's the pinnacle of citizenship in this supposedly democratic country, to vote for A or B, or A or A prime, you see. But in fact, the history of the country shows that when important gains were made in justice, in economic justice or racial justice, or the attention paid to the problems of women and the existence of women, whenever progress was made, it was not made through the initiative of people on top. It was made by citizens, by people getting together, by organizing, by the labor organizing, by anti-war people organizing, by women organizing, by disabled people organizing, by gay and lesbian people. That's when things change. It's important to know that so that you don't remain a passive citizen, and so that you understand that we all have a role to play. It seems to me that is the importance of people's history, and that's why I'm so glad that Ray Raphael has done his book, and now he's going to talk to you. Thank you. Yeah.
So Howard said that the people who give the orders around here, and of course he was the one to receive them, so he told me, he says, when I introduce you, I want to come. I want you to come. Okay, so he can give a few orders too. Right. I'm going to talk tonight about writing common people into history, why we do it, what we can learn from it, why it's so seldom done, what are some of the obstacles we face. The obstacles, let me give you an example of the obstacles we face. I moved out to California in the 1960s, and I met many people from the 1960s, California style. A lot of these people believed in past lives. And the ones who believed in past lives, it's phenomenal how many people during the Middle Ages had been princes and princesses. Very few peasants in those times. It was a reverse kind of social pyramid. So this is what we face. This is what we're up against. This actually goes quite profoundly deep in our society, in our consciousness. Common people, that's my focus. First, let me define that, common people. You have to watch out with people, the term people, because it's really that term can really be mustered from the left or the right or even the center in its behalf. The center, I'm referring to the will of the American people uttered by ultra-privileged male politicians in this last election, a little too often for my liking. So I'm going to define common people, very simple definition, as those who do not enjoy the special privileges of wealth, prestige, or political power. Or alternately, if you prefer, all those whom Alexander Hamilton warned us against. So why do we study common people? Okay, there's really several levels of it. First, on the most basic level, it's a question of just simple social justice, giving equal airtime, give credit where credit's due. Beyond that, what's really more important is it's through history that we learn how to interpret the political process, through the study of history. For years in school, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, so on, until you're about a senior, you learn history before you learn how our present political process is supposed to work. And in history, then, if you study the workings of from basically top-down history of the elite, that's the way you just come to imagine that's what politics is. That's the way history politics works, since it worked then. We can marginalize people in the past, therefore we can marginalize people in the present. So there's a whole political message there. Then beyond that, from the historian's point of view, you want to study common people just for the sake of accuracy. You leave out too much when you don't. Imagine a history of the Depression that basically is a study of FDR. Now, this is, comparable. If you go back to the Revolution, we have those things. We have histories of the Revolution, which are basically a study not of FDR, but of his counterparts. And they call that a history of the Revolution. Well, it leaves out too much. Let me give you an idea of some of the things that it leaves out that I cover in my book. What I do in my book, I take my lens, my focusing lens, and I switch from George Washington over here about 90 degrees and come over to his slaves, the Indians whom he displaced, the soldiers whom he commanded in the army, their wives, their mothers, the women who followed the army, all these other people. So let's look at some of these other people, the slaves. About 1 in every 5 slaves in the South ran to the British for their freedom during the Revolutionary War. This included 17 of Washington's own slaves, 30 of Jefferson's own slaves. And this was really an exodus of biblical proportions, really greater than the more famous Underground Railroad that followed. So huge consequences here. I guess Howard and I have an argument as to whether the Civil War or the Revolutionary War was the largest Indian war in our nation's history. But you think of Indian wars as, okay, the whites going out and after the Indians. And it's much more complex than that. In the Revolutionary War, every single Native American east of the Mississippi was directly affected by the Revolutionary War. Most of them sided one way or the other, and most of them sided with the losing side, namely the British. This opened up all the lands, and they suffered the consequences. It was really the largest war, Indian War, in the nation's history. Even the very beginning of the war, most people, everybody really agrees that the beginning of the American Revolution started in Lexington and Concord, shot heard round the world, Paul Revere and all that. That's April 19th, 1775. The previous summer, 1774, there were in every county seat throughout rural Massachusetts, thousands upon thousands of farmers went to the courthouses, dragged out every British appointed official, deposed them, dragged them out into the streets or onto the commons where they'd have to run the gauntlet. They made them take off their hats and recite their resignations between maybe 3,000, 4,000 to 6,000 people lined up on each side. Once was not enough. They had to do it over and over and over. They didn't have microphones, and all the people wanted to hear. At every juncture during these proceedings, the people would take votes. Was that resignation sufficient? Maybe he should change it. This amazing, amazing outpouring. By the end of it, you have the zero British presence in the Massachusetts countryside. 1774, 8 months before. What happens 8 months later, the British try to reconquer a land they had already lost, and that is the counter-revolution, which for all these years has masqueraded as the revolution, the beginning of the revolution. Phenomenal discovery. It's like the emperor's new clothes. Why don't people see that? Because we're locked into certain myths. We get those myths by too narrow a focus. If you just look at what the farmers were doing during that time, you see what's happening. Go on and on like this. All these people are seeking freedom. The slaves, the farmers, the Indians, they're all seeking their own version of freedom. It's not just the taxation without representation people. A lot of the loyalists were seeking their freedom. You have in Maryland, Delaware, Hudson Valley, New York, southern backcountry, you have loyalists who are rebelling against the elite, the patriot elite. The elite were patriots in those areas. These people become loyalists, and they fight for the loyalists for their freedom, lower-class tenant farmers. So pacifists, they're fighting for their freedom a whole different way. 1 in 30 free Americans during the Revolutionary time belonged to a religious, pacifistic organization which opposed all war, and this one in particular. They had to face the power of a very oppressive government which was going at them. They wanted their money, they wanted their bodies, and they wanted them to take oaths. These people wouldn't do it. A lot of them landed in jail. So there's a whole story in that. Women, a lot of us know that women gave up tea and fancy ornaments for the sake of the revolution. Well, some women gave up fancy ornaments and tea, those who could afford it. Tea was an upper class thing at that time. A lot of other women behaved quite differently. You had the lower class women, many of them joined the Continental Army basically. They had nowhere else to go. These were basically homeless people, and they became camp followers. Other women rioted against war profiteers for lower prices. You have a whole other level of involvement here. When you look at the revolution from the standpoint of class, too, you find out that it was really, in 1775, there was a massive outpouring of all classes, virtually all classes, except at the very top, of people against the British. By the end of that year, most people with any form of property, whether that was a shop or a farm, they went home to tend to that property. There was nobody left except poor people. They had to resort to a draft. So in this draft, if you didn't want to go, you'd be drafted, your number was called, you simply pay $20, you get a substitute. It's an easy way out if you have the money. So by the end of the war, you have an army which is absolutely class-driven, lower class only, except of course for the officers, and impressionable young boys. That's who won the Revolutionary War. This is all by class. Now, these are amazing. This is not the simple story. This is not the kind of the one-dimensional morality tale that we're raised with. And we're getting all this just by, all we have to do is look at the common people, and all this just emerges. We find all this. These are not really that controversial if you just look there. So why aren't we looking there? That's the big question I want to address now. What are the impediments to looking at people's history? Why don't we do it? First of all, there's the need to mythologize. I mean, all cultures have to create some kind of sort of founding mythology, why they came to be who they are, and implicitly that's a justification of who they are. So we've done that. We've created our founding myth, and in that myth we have our heroes. And these heroes kind of embody all the things that we supposedly want, all the virtues and the values that we aspire to. Then added to this, we have the natural human inclination to identify with somebody. So history kind of calls out for protagonist. It needs that one individual, the single person who embodies the attributes of the many. So we have George Washington is courageous. Meanwhile, there's 10,000 other men who are waking up, about to go into battle and having to face that battle, knowing they might die. And what do we learn? We learn George Washington is courageous. It's kind of a shorthand for the other people, and then the other people, drift through history, just kind of will get left out of that telling through this process. We have Washington marched against Cornwallis at Yorktown. I love that one, Washington marched, because Washington didn't march. Washington rode a horse. Actually, I think, according to Groucho Marx, he rode a white horse. I learned that because that was the only question I could answer at the end of his show. What was the color of George Washington's white horse? So he did make things easy because I was kind of young at that time. There was also one about Grant's tomb, but anyway. Where was I? Oh, yeah. So Washington is marching in this kind of grand single combat against Cornwallis. This kind of like leader down, this top down, it's really, it's trickle downs. You know trickle down economics? Okay, this is trickle down history. The historians don't call it trickle down history. They don't give, you know, that's not the official school of historians. We are the historians, because Howard and I believe we come from a school. We're kind of the school of people historians. And they don't say we're from the school of trickle down historians. But they do say, but there is another related word, it's called dissemination. And the way dissemination works is a few people have these great ideas. These are great thinkers and visionaries and wonderful people who generally tend to be quite well off and a lot of time to think about these things. And they envision something, and then it happens. So, you know, so you have like in the Revolutionary period, these great men conceptualize the revolution, and others follow. They just fall into line. Okay, you have a few men kind of like writing the play, and the rest are just delivering the script. These top people, they're called leaders. Think of what that means. You hear leaders. What does that mean? Even out here on your protest, there'll probably be like, you know, rebel leaders or whatever, you know, leaders. Okay. So now, if they're leaders, who's everybody else? It's a follower, right? I mean, that's the only way, you know, in a multiple choice test. Leaders, opposite, followers. Choose number A, and you're right. Okay. So you have leaders and followers. What does that do? That means these people are just like following along. It's a way of belittling their very real concerns. So if you're against any kind of social movement, you have a great vested interest in calling people leaders. This is the way it works. This is the way, and this is the way this is kind of in the sort of underlying grammar of the way most history is told from the standpoint of leaders. By the way, I have a very sad tale to tell about this, which is my first review. My first review was Kirkus Review, and it started out, People's History of the American Revolution, How Common People Shaped the Fight for Independence. This is the story of slaves, women, rebel leaders, etc. What do I have to do to get through? My very first review, rebel leaders. You know, this is not the story of rebel leaders, by the way. It's not my intent. Okay, these great people, there's a whole concept of how history works. It's not, you know, there's a much more dynamic flow between so-called leaders and followers. It doesn't work from the top down just like that. Let me give you an example, Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, one of the great documents of our time, right? Conceived by a mighty genius, Thomas Jefferson. Well, it's a great document, yes, and it says many great things. So were several other documents which preceded it on a local level, which had many of the same words, which were made by little county committees and conventions and so on, which drafted these things. And Jefferson had at his disposal, and he did a marvelous job of synthesizing all these lesser-known works and coming up with a document that then he is then credited with. And that's kind of a good model for the way that the process of leaders and followers. You actually have a groundswell of support doing a lot of the work, one person kind of putting it together in some way and then getting all the credit is kind of like, you know, just spun out of his mind in some kind of sort of immaculate conception sort of way. Okay. So anyway, this is what we're faced with, all these sorts of things. Now, in people's history, we also, a lot of this is, by the way, consciously manipulated to create, to lead away from the people, to create these special people on top. Let me read you a little section here. This is a direct quote from Charles Thompson. He's the Secretary of the Congress. I could not tell, the Continental Congress, that is. I could not tell the truth without giving great offense. Let the world admire our patriots and heroes, their supposed talents and virtues, where they were so, by commanding imitation will serve the cause of patriotism in our country. Okay, so he's very consciously creating this kind of image of heroes, and he doesn't want to burst the bubble. And so, of course, at the end of his life, he actually burns his papers, so we do not have, you know, whatever it was inside that bubble. You know, we don't know what it was. But we do get that idea. A lot of this stuff, if we just take a self-conscious approach to try to overcome it, we can. For instance, this Washington marched business. In people's history, I have I tell the military story of the war. I give a narrative. This actually is a narrative history. It's not kind of a haranguing history or, arguing points. This is a narrative. It tells stories, a myriad of stories. As a matter of fact, if you look at the index here and you see all the people in there, you're not going to recognize any of them. These are all stories about common people. But it is storytelling. So when I come to the military history, I tell the story through 5 common soldiers who were at the various battles, and that's the way I weave the tale. Okay, so it can be done, but you have to be very conscious about it. Even so, here's the biggest problem we face, which is more than just a problem of attitude. It's a very concrete physical problem that has to be addressed, and that's the problem of sources. Where do you get sources for slaves, for Indians, for tenant farmers who don't write, and so on? A lot of common people, particularly as we go back in time, they didn't write. Even if they did write, could write, they don't quite have the leisure or the kind of venue in which to write. Their letters aren't going to be preserved in secure family structures, nice libraries passed on generation to generation. So you have to overcome that. How do you do it? First of all, you look for what is there, and sometimes you get a little lucky. Out of 500,000 slaves in the United States at that time, there were 2 complete narratives. I mean, by complete, I mean, 20 pages long or something, about their experiences during that time. These were people who did flee to the British. They were preachers, so they basically wrote their memoirs in religious journals that were published during that time. So we're lucky. We do have those 2 stories. Then you have a few pension applications later on. But then, here's another one. An Iroquois warrior named Blacksnake. This is really one of my favorites. He didn't know how to write, but a friend of his learned a little English, and so he knew how to write. So Blacksnake dictated to his friend his memoir, and it's just fascinating stuff. I include a bunch of it in here. Incredible stories, such as we get an inside look about when the British are trying to basically convince the Iroquois warriors to join their side, and he narrates the entire argument, the debate within circles between the hawks and the doves. And then he also talks about what it's like to be part of a slaughter, what it likes to be on a massacre, kind of both ends. Incredible document. So you do get some of this. One great memoir which is published, I include some of it in the book, but a fuller version is the Shoemaker, George Robert Twelves Hughes, which is a book that several of you might be familiar with. Then you have a few soldiers did leave letters and later memoirs. The things that you learn from these first-hand pieces. Let me read you one, because this is really, in a nutshell, shows you how much you can learn from a very personal document. This is actually a pension application. This guy is applying for a pension after the war. What's beautiful about this is you didn't have to know how to write. This was oral history. They would actually, if you were applying for a pension, you would go and they would take down your story. So a lot of time it says, deponent says this, deponent says that. It was really a first-person kind of thing. Here we have, this guy is in the South, and this is a story he tells. His name is Moses Hall. The evening after our battle with the Tories, we having a considerable number of prisoners, I recollect a scene which made a lasting impression upon my mind. I was invited by some of my comrades to go and see some of the prisoners. We went to where 6 were standing together, some discussion taking place. I heard some of our men cry out, "Remember Buford." This was a site where the Tories massacred the Patriot prisoners. And the prisoners were immediately hewed to pieces with broadswords in revenge for Buford. At first I bore the scene without any emotion, but upon a moment's reflection I felt such horror as I never did before nor have since, and returning to my quarters and throwing myself upon my blanket, I contemplated the cruelties of war until overcome and unmanned by a distressing gloom from which I was not relieved until commencing our march next morning before day by moonlight. So he's sensitive to the tragedies of war. But later the next day, being on the left side of the road as we marched along, I discovered lying upon the ground something with appearance of a man. Upon approaching him, he proved to be a youth about 16, who, having come out to view the British through curiosity, for fear he might give information to our troops, they had run him through with a bayonet and left him for dead. Though able to speak, he was mortally wounded. The sight of this unoffending boy, butchered, relieved me of my distressful feeling for the slaughter of the Tories, and I desired nothing so much as the opportunity of participating in their destruction. So you have this very sensitive guy who doesn't want to do this, and this kind of he gets into it. This in a nutshell is war. This kind of strange, twisted logic of revenge. So a lot of these, when you can find the sources, take them. And basically, in the People's History, I've combed far and wide for every available direct source, and it's in there in part and fully referenced for you to find the rest. Okay. Beyond that, though, you have to be more creative. I use a trick I call reflected images. We have the documents of the elite, multi-volumes of them. They still don't have Washington's all completed. They've been working on it for decades now, the new version of Washington's. By looking at these things, you can get glimpses of of the life for the common people. For instance, 1777, July 4th, this is the first anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Washington's general orders: no women shall ride in the wagons. What's he talking about? What's he talking about is the women camp followers are riding in the wagons. He doesn't like that because he wants the wagons to be for the men so they'll save their energy. A month later, absolutely no women ride in the wagons. 2 months later, if any women ride in the wagon, the men will be punished, and so on. They're dismissed from the troops. He goes on, he keeps escalating the punishment. This goes on for 4 years, and until we find out from the one direct source from a camp follower at Yorktown that she arrived at Yorktown riding in a wagon. So what do we learn? We learned that the women rode in the wagons. We learned that the men appreciated what they were doing. They had they were into it. We learned that the men disobeyed orders whenever they wanted, pretty much. So we learn all sorts of things from these indirect sources, reflected images, I call them. One of the most incredible reflected images really comes from runaway slave ads. As I said, there are very few direct statements from slaves, but consider this. And as I read this, try to figure out what you can surmise by the slave owner, the slave in question, and the nature of slavery. All of this is there's a lot to be said. This is happening, this runaway slave ad appears really right when Lord Dunmore is issuing, the British governor of Virginia is issuing his proclamation freeing the slaves if they run to the British. Absented himself from the subscriber, the fourth of this instant, a Negro man named Limas. He is of yellow complexion and has the ends of 3 of his fingers cut off his left hand. He is well known in Charleston from his saucy and impudent tongue, of which I had many complaints. Therefore, I hereby give free liberty and will also be much obliged to any person to flog him so as not to take his life, in such manner as they shall think proper, whenever he is found out of my habitation without a ticket. For though he is my property, he has the audacity to tell me he will be free, that he will serve no man, and that he will be conquered or governed by no man. I forewarn masters of vessels from carrying him off the province. So, I mean, that's a whole textbook in the nature of slavery right there. Sometimes we don't even have that to go on. We don't even have reflected images, okay? But we can still make statements. Let's continue with the slavery theme. By the way, I'm focusing maybe more on slavery now, but I also deal with a full range. I have slavery, all the Native American groups east of the Mississippi are covered in here with complete narratives. Loyalists, pacifists, women of all classes, the boys who did the fighting, and so on. But I'm focusing on slavery here. These people did run to the British. Okay, we know that. What we don't know is how they made that decision. But about 1/5 of them did, 4/5 did not. It was a very dangerous task. I mean, a lot of them died. As a matter of fact, about as many people died trying to find their freedom in the British as white soldiers died in the war. They died from being caught, or they died from disease. So another unknown and huge fact. But they have to make a decision. Are they going to go, or are they not going to go? So how are they going to do this? Maybe they're going to call a meeting like this. Okay, all the slaves on Washington's plantation at 5 o'clock, let's get together and we're going to decide. We're going to have a rally. Yeah, it doesn't work like that. There's slave informers everywhere. This is dangerous business. We're talking about undercover, clandestine operations. So we know it has to have been, because there were slaves that were turned in. They have to have done it this way. So they're having these meetings. They have to be in small groups. They're making these decisions. Shall we run? Shall we not? So they're evaluating, if we run, what's going to happen if we get caught? What's going to happen once we get there? If we don't run, what happens if the British then conquer the plantation? We're going to be sold into slavery and go to the West Indies. They're trying to figure all this out. They're trying to weigh the dangers and the prospects. They have to be doing this. We have no records of the journals, okay? But we know they have to be doing this, so I include that in the story. It has to be. I call this situational reconstruction. I don't, by the way, call that in this book. That's a fancy word for Harvard. But situational reconstruction. In the book, I just talk about the kind of deliberations that they must be making. Because all I'm doing is I'm putting myself in their position and trying to evaluate their hypothetical prospects. Now, there's a movement in history which does exactly this. If you look into what's being done in, say, diplomatic history now, you'll see people say, you can't just look at history as a train leading up to the present. You know, everything has a neat conclusion to, you know, cause and effect to something else. That's too one-dimensional, and history doesn't work like that. At every point, there's choices, and that's what history is about, is those choices and why they make those choices. So to make those choices, you have to go back to the times and try to evaluate the prospects, and that's how you really get to learn about how the people are experiencing those times. This is done in all, you know, sort of political history. What I'm suggesting is we take this kind of sophisticated and very, very obvious approach all the way down to common people, do the full version. When we do this, we find all the people throughout the Revolutionary era are making very willed and conscious choices about how to participate in political action. You have Andrew Gearing, a pacifist. He's in jail because he won't take the oath. His minister is telling him, is saying, you're great, Andrew, because you're really true to your beliefs, so stay in jail. And his wife is telling him, it's August, the crops are in, if you don't do whatever you have to do to get out of jail, we starve. You know, he's making a decision. He's trying to figure that out. You have Joseph Plum Martin, one of my 5 principal soldiers here, talking in very moving terms about his decision. Shall he join the mutiny or not? He's patriotic. He believes in his cause. He's suffered all this time, and yet all the people are... So he doesn't want to go against his army, against his leaders, but they haven't been paid and they're starving. Does he mutiny or not? You have Cornplanter, the Iroquois warrior. He captures his own father, because his father is an Irishman, as it turns out, John O'Bale. And he captures him. What's he going to do with his own father when he captures him on the other side? You have another Iroquois captures his brother, who's also fighting on the other side. This is really a civil war. This is happening all over the place. What are these people going to do? How are they going to deal with these kinds of decisions? You have, this is a very moving one, several cases. You have questions of soldiers, whites and also some Indian soldiers, coming across an unarmed man, you know, and he's got the bead on him. He's pointing the rifle, and he has to decide whether to shoot the trigger, pull the trigger on a guy who he knows is going to die, you know, that direct. And these guys, for years later, this is haunting them. Okay, this is a view of war. This isn't the view of war that we get, you know, when we just kind of read the Revolution. It's not the rah-rah view. These people are making choices. They are political actors. And their actions are the revolution. There's sum total of actions. To get the full story, that's what we have to do. We have to study how all these people are navigating the troubled waters of revolution, seeking their own freedoms in their own multivarious ways. Okay? When we do this, what we do is we go beyond the simplistic morality tale, which is the usual revolution, good and bad, and of course we're the good, and we go and we arrive at a much more complex and intriguing and really humanly full picture, something we can really identify with, much more indicative of the true diversity that we're seeking today for our nation's identity, and also as individuals. So this is it. This is a people's history, and I've done what I could do. People's history, I think, you know, I'm to show you the book, I think, because, you know, I'm kind of proud of it. I think the New Press has done a great job with this book. And I'm totally thrilled to be involved with Howard on the project. And if you're into this thing, this people's history, okay, you have partly Howard to thank, and also Mark Favreau, who's, where is Mark? Is he around here? Stand up, Mark, wherever you are. Where are you? Are you here? Come on, stand up. Give it to, Mark is my editor at New Press. All the way up, Mark. I have a reason for this. Come on. All the way up. Okay. So I want you guys to recognize Mark, and here's the reason in my madness here, because he's kind of embarrassed because he didn't know I was going to do this. My reason is this is a People's History series, and we're really into input as to what that series could be, what further books, further ideas for the whole business. So it's an open-ended thing. Howard's working on the series with Mark, and I'm just kind of like hanging out and giving my 2 cents. So other people who have 2 cents to give, feel free. We hope the series is going to really help to push the study of history forward. Thanks. Oh, and I think what's happening now, maybe some people are probably need to leave if you do, but we're going to stay for about 15 more minutes, and Howard and I would love to have questions and engage in some dialogue.
If you'll please use the microphones, that would be very helpful. If it's too hard, we'll hand them to you.
So do we have...
Can you take one of the microphones up and down? There's a woman over on the left that wants to.
No? Didn't think they did, because they look good on you. What's that? Okay, do we have people waiting at a mic here? Okay, okay.
What I'd like to know is how are you going to get this stuff into the schools?
Thank you very much. Are you a plant? Did I tell you to say that?
No, I'm a mother with kids in school.
Excellent, even better. Okay.
Boston Public Schools.
That's right, good. Excellent question. This really is intended for use in that direction. A couple of steps. First of all, I did prepare a teacher's guide to this. Questions from all the way from the kind of simple comprehension questions to very complex critical thinking questions involving the footnotes. I mean, I have 1,000 footnotes in here referencing all the original sources and pointing people in those directions and even inviting people to challenge my statements and so on. So we have that, and that will be available shortly. And then we're also going to work on, there's a question of how these things are going to sort of get by the local school boards, which are written, the standards seem to be written more for a traditional form of history. So I'm going to try to prepare, and working with the national standards, a sort of master little sheet which will be available, with the, just request it and give me a couple of months for the thing to come out, and with the teacher's edition, showing how this fits in with the national standards. So you can actually have some ammunition to try to get it into your schools. Yeah. Mm-hmm. How do we work this?
Just let me add something to that. I ran into this problem when People's History of the United States came out. The problem was how to get it into the schools when the principal and the school board and maybe the chair of the department of the school won't like it. And one thing that people did is they simply photocopied parts of the book. And so long as we're free and easy, Mark Fevreau, you won't mind. The new press. No, but really, very often that's the only thing you can do. I mean, where you can get it approved officially, great, And what happens is there's a progression where people, this is what I found with the book. At first, there's surreptitious, photocopied chapters handed out to students alongside the regular text. And then, as the idea began to seep into the consciousness of the educational world and become more respectable, then after a while, adoptions and approvals and so on. So, I mean, I don't know how legal this is, but but we don't care.
Let me say also about schools. This is written for just an audience that any high school or college or general trade audience, but hopefully it would be available for lower. The stories in it can be extracted. This is apropos of the Xeroxing. So in other words, a teacher could take this and with a teacher's guide certainly develop all sorts of lesson plans with this material. Yeah.
I was in Binghamton, New York recently, and in the newspaper I read a controversy regarding an Indian Holocaust memorial. I wonder if you're familiar with this. Apparently, George Washington ordered the Indians in that region around Binghamton, he ordered General Sheridan, I guess, to eradicate the Indians, men, women, and children, including their villages. And I looked up a little bit about this, and apparently this did happen. Washington gave the order, and the Indians really were, many of them killed, and the rest were moved to, or moved themselves to Niagara. I wondered if, I never heard this before, and I was amazed. It appears to be true. Are you familiar with this? If it's true, why haven't we heard about this in history before?
There was a major, major campaign against the Iroquois by General Sullivan, and actually a lot of his officers kept journals, and the journals were fascinating because they were like the body counts, you know, for the Vietnam War.
And this was on direct order from George Washington?
Direct order, and except they were vegetable counts, because the idea was to starve them. So the orders were to burn every piece of everything that was growing. It was it was that defoliation, early version of defoliation. So they did this. They burned all the Indian fields throughout New York. And of course, the following winter was a very hard one and great starvation. And it did absolutely zero to stop the Indian raids, because the people who had survived were the warriors, and they were furious. So next year, of course, was much worse along the frontier. But that's what it was. It was really a genocidal type of operation. And you're right. It's covered. It's covered in the book, and then there are references where you can actually go back to the original sources written by once again reflected images. Because the Indians, actually, there's some of this. There is a captured Indian. Mary Jameson was captured when she was a child and she married an Iroquois warrior, and she wrote something, and she wrote about the starvation that followed, and that's in here. And then you can read actually the accounts of the officers themselves as well about this.
You can get the order from Washington in his, what is it, 1931, there's a 13-volume biography. You're probably familiar with that.
That's the Fitzgerald. There's
gives the order, and you can look up General whatever it is, Sullivan's journals too, and see his record.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a couple comments, mainly on Dr. Zinn's speech. I mean, I think I like the part you talked about how the U.S. has a history of class oppression and racism and racial exploitation. A history just, like Harvard also has a history of class exploitation and class oppression. And you also made the connection about that you have to use the study of history in terms of what to do to get rid of this. So I just wanted to address what I think needs to be done to get rid of class exploitation, to get rid of class oppression. And I'm a Marxist. I'm a follower of the Spartacist League. We put out the paper Workers' Vanguard. And we think that in order to get rid of racial oppression, there has to be, if you will, the history of a making of the history through the bottom up, in the same way the Bolsheviks made history in the bottom up, which is to put the working class in power through a third American Revolution, just like the Civil War smashed slavery. We think there needs to be a revolution to smash class slavery, smash wage slavery. And so I just wanted to encourage everybody to check out our paper, Workers' Vanguard, and also to read Marx, which I think explains history of capitalism.
Howard, you want to comment?
I don't think I need to comment, because it's not really a question, right? It's a manifesto, which, do we need revolutions from below? Yes, absolutely. But, that's what kind of revolutions, how, when? Well, that's very complicated. But anyway, it's a welcome point of view.
Hi. Thanks a lot for your comments. One of the things I think is that most of our traditional histories tend to skew heavily towards elite-driven histories, as you both discussed today. And the revolution is certainly a great example of that. And some of those reasons for it are contemporary, and some of them are interposed. And David Hackett Fisher in Paul Revere's Ride gives us a good account of how the Lexington Alarm, which had dozens and dozens and dozens of artisans involved with, became transposed by Longfellow because of Civil War propaganda into a single writer, a lone voice in the night. Right. Some of the reasons why we have an elite history of the revolution, I think, were contemporaneous with the revolution itself. And I was wondering if you might want to comment on what were some of those reasons for burnishing the elites. What was the perception of the elites at the time, and reasons for, if you look at Adams and Jefferson, they're self-conscious of their place in history. And in most of the, quote, founding fathers' writings, they're speaking to posterity. What do you see as being some of the reasons for their own skewing history in favor of?
Well, they had a very difficult job because they wanted something that was called a revolution, but obviously they didn't want revolution. So, you know, they had it's a hard balancing act. And they wanted to basically ally themselves with people who did want a revolution and then quickly distance themselves from those same people. And, you know, it's a complex way in which they did this. And that's all I can say. They sort of managed to pull it off, which was, anyway, that's, I guess it's to their credit, but it was, you know, after the revolution, there was an attempt at another revolution. Let me just, speaking of Shays' Rebellion, which Howard mentioned, remember I mentioned the 1774 revolution, which was the revolution. It was the real overthrow of the government throughout all of Massachusetts. That was in 1774. In 1786, exactly 12 years later to the day, actually one day less, because like in Springfield it was August 30th, and 12 years later it was August 29th, because the way the courts were meeting, the exact same people showed up, but not quite as many of them, and tried to do the exact same thing. They tried to engage in a second revolution. This is something in terms of the history of Shays' Rebellion, it's never fully understood because people don't understand the context that these guys were just trying to do a repeat performance. And the result was the first one succeeded and the second one failed. And that's sort of how you can mark what happened after the revolution. That was the mark that the revolution was not going to, the second revolution, the full social revolution, was not going to succeed. There's a lot more to speak about that. I'm glad you raised the issue, but, you know, I mean, that's a huge issue. Yeah.
Let me just say one more thing about that, and that is that there's this continuity, you know, that Ray is talking about, you know, from 1774, 1786, and of course before 1774 and after 1786, but in the midst of the revolution, in the midst of the war against England, which presumably is, you know, as Ray said, you know, the story is of the United Colonists, patriotic war, and so on. But in the midst of that, there are mutinies, which are class-based. That is, the soldiers, the privates, are being treated like dirt. The officers are being treated like kings. And, you know, they're getting high pay and good clothes and good food, and they're having parties and so on. And the privates are not giving any clothes, not getting any pay, and they're being kept in when they want to be mustered out. Their time of service is up. And so they mutiny in 1781. There are a number. In 1781, there's the mutiny of thousands of soldiers in the Pennsylvania line, and Washington has to be very careful in dealing with that because there's thousands of them, and he's worried, and he expresses this, that this may spread to the whole Revolutionary Army. And so he deals with them by compromising. But then shortly after that, there's another mutiny in the New Jersey line where only a few hundred mutineers are involved. And at that point, Washington gets tough. And, you know, there's this romanticized picture of Washington, which, well, as we see, is dispelled when you look at how he treats black people and how he treats Indians, but also how he treats, presumably, his own soldiers. When he feels he can handle the mutiny in the New Jersey line, his orders are shoot them. And so they take out, by random, actually, it's almost like the movie Paths of Glory, where they, you know, pick out at random, you know, the troublemakers. At random, they pick them out, and they have them executed by their fellow mutineers.
Yeah. I think sometimes it's hard for people, whether historians or just students in school, to pursue lines of thought that go against what the mainstream is telling them is the right thing to believe and what is oftentimes the more easy thing to believe in. And I've read a couple of Mr. Zinn's books, and I feel like I have somewhat of an idea about how that process occurred in his life. But I was just curious about when you made the decision. You mentioned earlier, I don't know, jokingly or not, about being in a school of people's historians, how do you get to that place? You know, it's not like your education probably led you to that early on. What makes you follow that path?
I'm going to give you sort of an academic version and a political activist version. The academic one is actually when I first ran into when I was in high school, and I ran into one of these collections of slave narratives, you know, from the WPA projects, and it was B.A. Botkin, Lay My Burden Down. It was a collection of those where the writers went down and collected all the narratives. I could not believe I was reading these, you know, first-hand accounts from slaves. I was so struck by this. I mean, I don't know, it hit me deeply. The other one is an activist, and really got me into the power of people's history, was Howard Zinn. And Howard Zinn, he doesn't know this. I was about to tell him this story this afternoon, and we ran out of time, so I'm telling it to you now.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, right. I know, because we've been waiting all this time. Right, that's why he's sitting there. He's still waiting. I know, right. So here's what happened. I'm in the South in 1964, working with SNCC. I was just a volunteer, and meanwhile, and this is a big year. You know, it's where the people are murdered and everything, and there's bombings and all this is going on, and then we're preparing for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to go to the convention to challenge. So. Anyway, meanwhile, what's in the press is still there's all this stuff about Martin Luther King and the established leadership. And what I'm seeing on the ground is this incredible. I mean, these people who work with SNCC, I couldn't believe them. I couldn't believe them. I was just awed. I was like floored. I mean, this was like, I don't know, to see their commitment and the dangers they faced every day and their life force and their vitality. And then, right then, Howard Zinn comes out with a book called SNCC, The New Abolitionists. And it's amazing. It gets the story absolutely right. And I'd been in the movement for a while at this time, and every time you're in the movement, you go to a demonstration, then you read about it in the paper the next day. You know, what? That wasn't the demonstration I was at. And here there's a political event, and I'm seeing, and he's writing about it from the bottom up. And this was before that term bottom up had even been coined, and he's doing it. And that really impacted me, that could be done. You know, so indirectly, most people here are kind of affected by the people's history, and you know, I guess we shared enough in common that we go that far back. So, so Howard is no Johnny-come-lately to this movement. Yeah.
I was fascinated by what you were saying about the Indians and enslaved blacks running to the British Army. Could you speculate whether they would have been better off if the British, you know, had in fact prevailed?
If the British had prevailed?
Yeah.
Once they ran to the army, they didn't really... there's two stages. The early part of the war where they were actually technically offered their freedom, and a few received it, but not that many. And then later in the war where they went by the droves, that's where the tens of thousands went. And this time it was just sort of an implicit thing, maybe you'll get free, and they weren't. Basically what happened, they would become servants of officers, they would be placed in very hard labor situations, some of them would actually be taken off as slaves by loyalists. So very few really, out of approximately 80,000 slaves that ran to the British for their freedom, 3,000 exactly received their freedom, and I'd say that is the number of slaves that were recorded as being taken to Canada, you know, for the, you know, as free slaves after the war. Now, it's hard to say what would have happened. What did happen is the revolution for the institution of slavery tended to rigidify that institution, because before the revolution, the institution of slavery hadn't really been challenged, and this did challenge it, and that caused the slave owners to create a kind of reaction. And so a lot of the tale of the revolution for slaves is increasing reaction at home. Momentary kind of freedom. Some of these people actually, there were maroon communities where they actually were free for a while, so there was kind of a momentary taste of freedom, and then after war, clamped down totally. That's where you get the rigidified slave codes. They came right in the wake of the revolution.
I really am enjoying this session, and particularly with the questions that came out, because that made concrete some of the implications for doing a new social history with looking at it in a more comprehensive, holistic way. One of the things that I wonder, and I'm going to get your book to see it, to what extent can we spell out, make obvious how our understanding of where we are today is changed and different because of what we now know about what happened then? Now, Richard, we know that it was complicated. There were many different groups with different particular perspectives and issues. It wasn't organized and integrated as it seems in retrospect. The future always looks uncertain. The past looks like it's inevitable. So the question is, when we do these kinds of histories, is it clear, do we try to spell out how our understanding is now different and more adequate to the outcome that we saw in the more limited histories from top down? In your book, you tried to show how our understanding about the American Revolution is either deepened or in some way changed, number one. Number two, are there lessons when we look at that at this period? Are there lessons we can draw for today?
Okay.
Just as we use today to
Yeah.
do that?
Well, remember I said at the beginning that when we learn, history is how we learn the grammar of the political process. You know, it's how we learn to interpret the political process. So and I use that in a negative way, because when we learn the elite history, that's what we're learning. So you can just take the converse of that to answer your question. If you learn the history, if you growing up, you learn that people are proactive, that people gather together, that what democracy means is not voting, or it's a lot more than voting. It's people gathering together for their own interests and standing up for their interests and so on. You take that kind of image of that grammar and translate it to the present, presumably, you will make that a much more normal or accepted or integral part of contemporary society. These things aren't, and it's no accident, really, that this kind of history is coming out today. I mean, this history really is, in a sense, it's flowing directly from the 1960s. The historians that are really, I mean, a lot of this is based on historical research, which has come directly out of the 1960s by a great wave of new social history.
Just leave one little example. In my teaching career, I had an opportunity to learn about American economic and social history. And I use Lowell as an example. I learned from my colleagues, we taught a course in an interdisciplinary fashion. And I understood much more deeply how the feminist movement over the course of our history developed. Yeah. The unintended consequence of the Industrial Revolution and getting cheap farm girls to come in was in the course of learning disciplined work and organization, being educated by people like Thoreau in order to please their fathers. They had a special educational program. And then when there was a cutback in work because the merchant princes who couldn't ply the trade to China had an opportunity to invest in developing textile industries, overbuilt, they cut their wages to these women. The women then organized, as many of us know, and it shows how the nature of life itself, as partly predicted by Karl Marx, the actual experience of organization transforms people and develops leadership for the next several generations. Women who were active in the feminist movement and in the abolitionist movement and the like. So I think there's a lot of important observations we can make and lessons for today.
Right, and the message is that if we do this with any particular period or subject in history, if you take that attitude, you're going to wind up with that kind of impact on contemporary consciousness. Thank you. Right. Right, yeah. We're told we have 3 more questions, these 3 people, so we are told that. Anonymous, right. Yeah.
I'd just like to commend you both, because not only does your work bring more perspective, but it brings passion to education. So thank you.
Thank you.
A reminder that you can use C-SPAN video in your... Now a discussion about the influence of common people in the American Revolution. This event's about an hour and a half.
Education, and on behalf of our Dean, Jerry Murphy, I'm very happy to welcome you here tonight. I'd also welcome you to pick up a flyer of the upcoming events that we have here. We will be finishing our forum season here on May 15th. But next week we have Jean Traunstein, who is speaking about her new book, Shakespeare Behind Bars, and showing excerpts, film excerpts from her prison students' performance of Merchant of Venice. And on Thursday of that week, we have Robert Torres, a gay Puerto Rican educator who was the narrator and subject of a really amazing film called New Yorican Dream. And we will be showing that movie and discussing the film with Robert Torres afterwards. And on May 7th, Mary Mazzio, Carol Gilligan, and Mary Jo Kane, who's the University of Minnesota's director of the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sports, will be here to show and talk about the Title IX film called A Hero for Daisy, which is about the tenacious 1976 Yale women's rowing team. And Franz de Waal, a primatologist from Emory University, will be here to talk about The Ape and the Sushi Master. That has to be an all-time great title, on May 9th. And we end our forum season with Ray Kurzweil, the inventor extraordinaire and techie guy, and author of The Age of the Spiritual Machine, who's going to be in conversation with Howard Gardner, the multiple intelligences guru, and the two of them will be speaking about intelligence, computer, and human. So we would welcome you to any or all of those, and but of course for tonight, we're here to listen to and experience, and for those of you who know Howard, you know the informed word is experience, both Howard Zinn and Ray Raphael. It's actually quite wonderful to have them here this week. Both Howard and Ray are known for their social consciousness and their social activism, relic terms often associated with the 60s and the 70s. But this week, Harvard Yard has been the site of an extraordinary burst of social activism as Harvard students have taken over Memorial Hall to protest the failure of the university to pay some of its employees a living wage. I hope you'll indulge me as I quote from an open letter to the community from over a dozen housemasters as it appeared in the Crimson yesterday. We, as housemasters, recognize that the issue of a living wage affects the quality of our community life in the Harvard houses. In the houses, the living wage issue has a human face. The Living Wage Campaign invites us to ask if we are doing as much as we can to ensure that the workers in our communities are receiving adequate compensation for their work and their contributions to our daily lives.
Very happy to be here with Ray Raphael. We actually, we've done a couple of things before. We just did something in New York, and we did something, we were together in California. It's becoming a thing. And I'm very glad Dario started off talking about what's going on here, the students sitting in for a living wage, because you're right, that's if we're writing a history of Harvard University, we might leave them out unless we were doing a people's history of Harvard University. And if we're doing a people's history of Harvard University, then we would have them. And then we'd have the anti-war protesters of the 60s. And then we'd have the members of the John Reed Club. We'd have all the people who were turned over to the FBI by Harvard University. Now, maybe I'm exaggerating, but well, there's some connection between Harvard University and the establishment. Isn't there? I think so. No? But no, of course not. But I suppose I contrast this, the sit-in, as a people's history, and I contrast that with the other Harvard, and the other Harvard is epitomized for me by walking into Widener Library, and unless they have now removed it, but I doubt it, but then when you go up the stairs of Widener Library, you see this tribute to a soldier. And tribute to a soldier is good, except that there's a slogan that accompanies this tribute to a soldier. And there are different ways you can pay tribute to a soldier, and there's a way you pay tribute to a soldier which is unsettling. And this tribute at Harvard, it says, Happy is he who with one embrace clasps death and victory. Am I right? Do you remember that? Yeah. I didn't like that, you see. And every time I went into Widener, yeah, that I was reminded of that. So anyway, it's good. These people who are sitting in are reminding us of the invisible people. And that's the idea of a people's history. You know, that's what Ray is doing in his People's History of the American Revolution. I'm not the co-author of that book. So, you know, right? Some people think, you know, because my name appears, I have to make sure, even though I want to be the co-author of every good book, but I'm not the co-author of that book. But the New Press, which is doing this series, you know, said to me, will you be general editor of the series of People's History series? And I thought, I don't want to be general editor of anything. And then they
appreciate the care and diligence of our students in bringing this issue of wages to the attention of the entire Harvard community in their work and written reports over the past 2 years. We have deep respect for their commitment to social and economic justice, and we support them in their commitments. And it has really been quite extraordinary to see how the Harvard community has really rallied solidly behind this issue. We could never, in our wildest dreams, have contrived such a meaningful welcome for Howard and Ray. Two men committed to writing and teaching about history from the point of view of those who are often most neglected and ignored. Howard and Ray exercise what they call a bottom-up approach to examining new and critical perspectives on the American past. And in doing so, they've created histories which resonate with all of us. Their histories tell stories. And through engaging us in the struggles of ordinary people, they give us connection, understanding, and insight to times and events which previously seemed lifeless and irrelevant. People of all colors from every class and economic level walk through their books, and in doing so, help us to understand not the extraordinary, but the ordinary events which cumulatively make up the fabric of this country. Howard Zinn is the series editor and inspiration for the New Press's People's History. He is a professor emeritus at Boston University, despite John Silber's best wishes, and author of A People's History of the United States, the award-winning Declarations of Independence, Failure to Quit, as well as a recent memoir entitled, and another excellent title, You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. He is also the author of the play Marx in Soho. Raphael grew up in New York City, received his BA from Reed College and his MA from Berkeley. He then left academia to work in the peace and civil rights movements of the 60s before becoming part of the Back to the Land movement of the 70s, moving to the backwoods of Northern California, removed from electricity, telephone, and pavement. While living there, he taught in a one-room public high school teaching history, math, English, forestry, and physical education. He's a prolific writer. His works include An Everyday History of Somewhere, The Teacher's Voice, The Men from the Boys, Rites of Passage in Male America, and now A People's History of the American Revolution. Tonight we'll begin with Howard Zinn, then move to Raphael, and we will finally give you all a chance to ask your own questions. So thank you for coming. Howard.
All right. Thank you, Dottie Engler, for organizing this. I think you organized this. You're the one who always calls me. So what the latest legal struggles were, you know, on the level of courts and, you know, and what possible legislation there might be in Congress and what the president might be saying. But the things that I was seeing on the ground level were not becoming part of history. And so I wrote a letter to Columbia University, my alma mater, although I don't have a maternal or paternal relationship, you know, but, you know, it's, let's put it this way, I went to Columbia University, and that's where I got my doctorate, that's where I did my graduate work, and I knew they had an oral history project. which was new at that time. Now oral history is known. That time oral history was new. There was no Studs Terkel around then. Well, he was around, but he wasn't doing those things. And Oral History Project. And I had, in fact, done some work in the Columbia University Oral History Project. And I knew what the Oral History Project consisted of. It consisted of somebody interviewing ex-secretaries of state, ex-generals, ex-admirals, almost everybody who was important in the higher echelons of government and industry, and trying to catch them before they died. And that's the trick of oral history. You follow the health reports, and you interview people who are about to go, and you get them at the right moment. So I knew that's what the Oral History Project consisted of. And so I wrote to Columbia University, I wrote to the Oral History Project, and I said, hey, well, I didn't start off that way, because you don't write that way to Columbia University. But I said, there's terrific oral history to be done down here. I mean, come down, send somebody down here with tape recorders. Tape the people in Albany, Georgia, who's been demonstrating. I mean, who knows what's happening in Albany, Georgia? Tape these people who've just come out of jail in Albany, Georgia. A good part of the black population in Albany, Georgia has been in jail. Talk to them. Go to Selma, Alabama. Tape the Selma Freedom Chorus and a church rally that takes place before people are going out to try to register to vote in Selma. Go to Greenwood, Mississippi. Talk to Mrs. Ruby Pilcher, who lives next door to the Freedom House set up by the SNCC workers, and who brings them food and takes care of them, and talk to her about her life, and that's oral history. I got this letter back from Columbia University. That's a wonderful idea. When somebody starts off that way, you get very suspicious. A wonderful idea, it's like Gandhi said about Western civilization, a great idea. But we don't have the resources. We don't have the resources. Columbia University doesn't have the, because I think of general editors being one of these academic entrepreneurs, No. But then they sent me Ray's book, and I read it, and I thought, wow, I've read a fair amount on the American Revolution. This is the best single book on the American Revolution that I've read. So, happy to do this. So, yes, there's a connection between the history of invisible people in the past and the story of invisible people in the present. There's the connection between, the invisible people of the American Revolution and its time and the invisible people in our time. And it seems to me you can go from one to the other. That is, by looking at the present and being conscious of the people we don't notice in the present, you can then be induced to look into the past and say, hey, what are the counterparts of these people I know about today, the cleaning people and the immigrants and the hard-working people who are overlooked? What is their counterpart in the past? And that leads you to a people's history of the past. That leads you to look for different things in the past than the kind of things you get in traditional textbooks. Or you can go the other way. You can go into history and read a book like Ray's, or read other books that will tell you about Native Americans and women and black people and working people and African Americans, and then ask yourself, what is their counterpart today? But in either way, a connection is made between the past and the present. And it's important to know that, because there's no point going into the past if you're never going to come out of it. And there's no point going to the past unless you're going to make a connection between what you learn about the past and what you see in the present. I must tell you, let's see, how I came to, this sounds very dramatic, how I came to my present point of wisdom. I must tell you how I came to think of doing people's history. I was in the South. I was living in the South. I was teaching at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, in Black Women's College. Became involved in the movement, and then became involved with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Began moving around the South, becoming a kind of writer participant in the movement. Went to Albany, Georgia, and Selma, Alabama, and wherever SNCC was doing things, wherever the movement was engaged, and going into towns in Mississippi and Jackson and Greenwood and Greenville and Hattiesburg and so on. And it occurred to me, the things I was seeing, I know were not being recorded anywhere. They're not becoming part of anyone's history. Oh, sure, I was reading in the papers about what the heads of the NAACP were saying